Hey there, folks. Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast here again with another installment of Abolitionist Abstractions. So, here in the good old USSA, we recently had one of the hallowed days of the year, Memorial Day. A day where we are supposed to honor those who have given the ultimate sacrifice to purportedly defend our freedoms. Now, I was going to let this go by and talk about something else this week, but yesterday I happened to be listening to a recent Joe Rogan podcast, which was recorded on Memorial Day, and he had Rick Schroder on. For those who don't know Rick Schroder, he used to go by the name Ricky Schroder, former child star. I grew up with him in the sitcom Silver Spoons. He has since gone on to become a pretty accomplished actor. Now he's also directing and producing. Always liked the guy from a acting standpoint. I always thought he was good. And I'm always interested when people start doing documentaries and stuff like that, which is his new projects. So I figured I'd give it a listen. His newest project that's either has just come out or is just about to come out. This particular documentary is called The Fighting Season, and it has to do with the war in Afghanistan. Now, after listening to this interview, I had a renewed sense of feeling a necessity to talk about these particular topics because the basis of the documentary is that he went over to Afghanistan for, I think he said 110 days, and was embedded in multiple different platoons and units over there. Him and his cameramen, I think he said there was 5 of them altogether, who spent time going out on missions and getting to see what war was like firsthand. He described the fact that he's always had an interest in war, although he never actually came out and said that he just refused to actually enlist himself. But he made mention of it multiple times. His grandfather was a World War II vet and used to regale him with stories, gave him all his memorabilia. So he's always had this interest in it, and he wanted to see what it was all about. Now, this sounds like a rather honest documentarian to me because, well, if you're going to discuss something, if you're going to write about something, do a video about something, you should probably have at the very least, a working knowledge on the subject, and things that you don't actually know about. Immersing yourself in them is usually a good way to find out. So, up till that point, it all sounds good. Until he started talking about what he learned and the new respect he came back with. And the blatant contradictions he described, but did not actually address. He just glossed over them and spoke them as if they weren't contradictions at all. Joe Rogan pushed him a little bit. They're obviously friends. They stated such at the beginning of the interview. So it's not like it was going to be an attack piece or anything like that. But Rogan kind of pushed him a little bit and said something to the effect of, soldiers having to follow orders. And Rick got a little defensive because he had obviously made friends with some of these soldiers over there, and tried to make it very clear that Well, that's not necessarily true. That's just a misconception that a lot of people have, that soldiers are just blind order followers. And he saw plenty of times where maybe not as soon as the command was given, but shortly after the fact, lower ranking members would pull their superior officers aside and then voice their displeasure with what had been said, and then question the orders. Now, I have no way of knowing if this is true or not. I'll just take Rick's word for it for now. But of the people I know who have served in the military, or are still serving, I've gotten mixed reactions to that question, because people will often say, well, of course, we need to follow certain orders to protect, but we're not blind order followers. We can speak up when we need to. But the problem with Rick's comments is, within a sentence or two after that, he was referring to the necessity to follow orders, and how these soldiers are just doing what they're told. They're not making the decisions. And sure, if something is passed down that they question, there may be a little internal struggle, but ultimately they have to obey, because otherwise someone could get killed. Now, this is common rhetoric tossed around by supporters of the military. The one thing they fail to mention in that is, well, yeah, but when the orders do get followed, somebody will almost assuredly be killed. That doesn't seem to matter to them, though. It's only if they're going to get killed, or somebody they know is going to get killed, or one of their boys is going to get killed. They don't extend the same courtesy to others. So, I have no intention of watching the fighting season. Not necessarily just because it has to do with the military, because I do like to get different angles on things. I do like to examine articles, videos, documentaries on subjects that I'm interested in, but come from a perspective I wouldn't necessarily agree with, because I guess it kind of falls under that, know thy enemy mantra. Not that I'm necessarily calling all of them my enemies, but, I like to know how other people think. I like to see if I can possibly learn something that I wasn't aware of, see a different perspective, or if I'm easily able to poke holes in the story that is presented. This particular documentary, I don't think I'll have any interest in seeing because of the way it was presented. He claimed he made the claim, and again, it may be true, I don't actually know, so I don't want to disparage the man by saying, oh, he's just making a claim, it didn't happen. But he claimed that he had shot 650 hours worth of video in the 110 days that he was there, and they condensed it down to a 6-hour documentary series. Each piece of it is an hour long. And one of the questions Rogan did ask him was if any of these single documentary pieces, which are supposedly about individual type stories, because they were following different platoons, they were with different units, and he was trying to get a personable aspect to this, so he wanted to do like individual stories. And he said, he talked about how they had followed these different individuals and these different stories, and a lot of them, to use his words, led nowhere, so they just kind of got pushed off to the side. And Rogan asked him if he had put any of these failures in the movie, because as he described it, the failure was missions that were unsuccessful, or things they were supposed to be doing that just did not materialize. And had he said yes to this question, I might have been more intrigued. But his answer was, no, we didn't put any of the quote-unquote failures in. But then he quickly followed that by saying this is a movie or a documentary that he thinks everybody should see because it's not telling a narrative story like the media would portray, where they just go in and out, get a quick 5-second sound bite, and they craft the narrative. Well, he's obviously crafting a narrative if he only wants to put the positive stuff in, if he only wants to put the so-called successes in. So, to me, it just doesn't seem worth it. But it was listening to that interview that made me rethink discussing Memorial Day and the idea of people getting upset if you don't hold such a day in reverence. As somebody like myself, I deal with that a lot. Whether it's on social media and the stuff that I post, the questions that I ask, whether it's my daily interactions with people as I'm working, because I tend to, especially now in the warmer weather, I tend to wear nothing but, I like to call it abolitionist advertising, because all of my t-shirts are anarchy and abolitionist and anti-state related. I do that purposefully, not just to announce who I am to others, but I find that not as often as I like, but often enough, they become conversation starters. For instance, I had an interview with a potential new client the other day, and normally I do change for stuff like that because I don't want to freak everybody out. But I walked in wearing an anti-Fed shirt, and at the end of the interview, the gentleman said, "That's a very interesting shirt. What does it have to do with?" So I figured, well, if he doesn't want to hire me for who I am, then I don't really want to work for him anyway. So I began to explain, and at the end, he looked at me, nodded his head, and asked me to give him £1 because he said that's pretty awesome. So I do like stuff like that and put myself out there, and it draws a lot of ire. Obviously, if I am on social media and I go into a debate forum where there's many a statist, they'll all attack me, but I deal with it just with my so-called friends and a lot of family members who are very agitated when I speak about these things, or when I don't hold these days in reverence like they do. They will point to my own family members who have served, and how would I feel if one of them hadn't come home? Well, that in and of itself is kind of ridiculous, because all of my family members who served did so before I was even on this planet, so how would I have felt? I wouldn't have known any different. I may have grown up a little differently, because some of them may not have been around, but I wouldn't have known, because they just never would have been there to begin with. And once I bypass that, then they want to talk about their friends and family who have died and how that affected them. And while it may be very sad for them personally, and I do not begrudge anyone their own feelings on a certain matter, these are all just emotional appeal. There is no logic behind any of these statements, because that is what the propaganda is all about. It is tugging on people's heartstrings to help perpetuate the idea that being overly emotional about these topics is far superior to thinking them out logically and rationally. That is how the state, well, one of the ways the state helps perpetuate itself. That is why logic is not taught in government indoctrination camps beyond the field of mathematics. That is why the critical thinking that is taught is only to a certain extent, because if the average individual understood logic and how to use it consistently, and understood how to truly critical think, they would be able to see behind the thin veil of the government bullshit. And that's actually one of the saddest things, is once you come to these realizations, you realize how thin the veneer was, and that all that was standing between you and the truth was this paper-thin layer of garbage. And it was just placed very well and put in front of your eyes at a very young age, so that by the time you reach the age of intellectual maturity, which most estimations are somewhere around the age of 25, that our brain finally stops developing. Once you've reached that point, it's so ingrained in your system that to question what you think you know is similar to questioning whether your hand, which you can feel with your other hand, actually exists. Or if it's just a figment of your imagination. So, a large part of the problem, obviously, is that because the average person is not thinking critically and does not understand logic, and they are easily swayed by emotional bullshit, if you speak out against the government and its agents, especially ones that people may know personally, they take it very offensively, even if you're not just simply trying to rustle jimmies, which I know many of us are prone to do from time to time, because, well, it's just fun. But even if you attack it from a purely logical and even are polite in your interactions, so many people get so quickly defensive and they just don't want to hear it. And all they can do is repeat the rhetoric they've been force-fed their whole lives. That, well, they're fighting for our freedom, and these certain people died for our freedom. But when you try to get them to explain what freedom exactly they died for, there's a lot of stammering, there's a lot of hemming and hawing, and a lot more times than not, it ends up with them giving you some variation of the, well, if you don't like it, you can leave, rather than actually answering the question. Now, the problem with these so-called freedoms that the troops are allegedly and have allegedly been protecting is that I can't remember the last time someone from another country came over here and tried to take my freedom. But these soldiers are sent all over the world to protect our freedom. Seems a little odd. I mean, when you set aside the political rhetoric and the history that you were quote-unquote taught in government-sanctioned institutions and the appeals to emotion, and you take a look at what has occurred over the past 150 plus years, it can easily be argued that the last time anyone actually fought for some so-called American freedoms was when the Confederate soldiers had to take up arms against the aggressors from the North in the erroneously named Civil War. I prefer the War of Northern Aggression, or even the War of Federal Aggression, because that's really what it was. But that was the last time. You know, even the great wars that everybody likes to talk about, you know, with the Greatest Generation and such. World War I, our freedoms weren't being threatened. World War II happened because of World War I. And the attack that supposedly forced FDR's hand, again, when you strip away the bullshit, it's easily argued that the sanctions that were put on Japan in the first place are what caused them to attack. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that FDR and his ilk not only knew that would be the eventual outcome, but they actually had prior knowledge of the attack on Pearl Harbor and when it was going to happen. So again, it wasn't American freedoms that were being attacked. It was a retaliation for sanctions which were affecting an entire country. Which, of course, anytime the U.S. government places sanctions on another country, they are allegedly doing it to force some kind of compliance from that government. But it always backfires, although that's to say that you actually believe the intent of the sanctions in the first place. But let's say that's the case. They backfire because the sanctions only affect the citizenry. The ruling class of that country manages to make life even harder on their citizenry, and all the while convincing them, somewhat correctly actually, that it's the evil U.S. that is causing these problems. Now, that's not to absolve these tyrants in their own right from doing horrible things to their own people to begin with, but they're not actually wrong about blaming the U.S. government for what occurs after that, because, well, kind of started it. So if those two wars weren't actually about protecting freedom, it's kind of hard to even consider that any of the other ones since then were. Korea, our freedoms weren't being attacked, and in fact, it's finally, well, happened a while ago, but, 50 plus years later, as is usual with the federal government and their classified data, that was another false flag, the Gulf of Tonkin. The U.S. government had to lie to the people to get them psyched up to send their sons and daughters halfway across the world to kill people they had never met. But that, of course, is all part of how the game is played. It's kind of hard to convince the average decent person that they should go around killing people they've never met just on the word of someone in some position of authority without stretching the truth a little bit, shall we say. So, Korea, nope, no freedoms there. Vietnam, definitely no freedoms there. All the other little skirmishes and interventions in between, nope. Then it started to become about other people's freedom, and we're just trying to protect their freedom. Of course, they failed to mention that by protecting other people's freedom, we're going to extort more money from you and put your friends and family members and neighbors at risk because we're doing good. And it really seemed like the tide of this was starting to change just a little bit. More and more anti-war type voices were coming to the forefront. And then 9/11 happened. And this one is really hard for people to wrap their heads around and not and look at it with an objective eye, because now the hardcore nationalist types can say, well, see, now we were attacked on our soil, and they came here and they started with us, and now we have to go wipe everybody out. I obviously don't believe the government narrative, but even if it were true, even if everything they said is exactly what happened, 19 individuals snuck into the country and did all these things and got all this training, and managed to hijack the planes and flew them into the towers and the Pentagon and the one that fell in the field in PA. Even if all that was true, of those 19, 15 were allegedly Saudi Arabia nationals. But instead, war was declared on Afghanistan, and then Iraq. But it's that nationalistic fervor that convinces people that that was the right thing to do, that they came here, and because they hate us for our freedom. Well, we don't have much freedom for people to hate us for, number one. Number two, that kind of leaves out all the shit that the U.S. military has been starting for years all around the world. They are constantly intervening. They are constantly occupying different lands, all in the name of goodness, of course. But that's the real kicker right there. Is so many people are upset that some individuals dared come to our country and kill all these people, but they don't see the hypocrisy of constantly sending their troops to other countries to kill people. And when I speak out about 9/11 and the after effects, that draws even more ire from my friends and family, because it's fresher in most of their minds. And especially with my family, because they think I'm dishonoring our own family, because unfortunately one of my cousins was in one of the towers and was one of the ones who did not make it out. He worked for Canada Fitzgerald, and he was up on one of the top floors when the plane struck. So to even discuss that, what occurred afterwards was not a very good thing, is like blasphemous with a lot of members of my family, and other friends who also live here in New York and had friends and family that were among those that were killed. But that's that appeal to emotion again. They don't want to think logically. They just want to think about their fallen friend or their fallen family member, and nothing else matters. And if you go against what is considered the popular narrative, then you just don't care. But that's the thing that most of them don't realize, is that I do care. I do care that innocent people are being killed all the time. I do care that humanity is still in such a state that they can be easily swayed, and men and women with good intentions who honestly believe that they are just protecting their fellow man can be so seduced by the rhetoric and the propaganda and, well, let's just say it, the blatant lies, and have no problem getting flown around the world to threaten and or kill people they have never met, all on the word of some authority that said, we need to do this because X. I do care about these things, not just because I am constantly extorted to supposedly help pay for these efforts, but I would like to see humanity survive. I would like to see it improve. So to say I don't care is disingenuous. I just care for different reasons than the average person does. So, this comes up every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, most of the time on the 4th of July, and now on the date 9/11 itself. You're supposed to pay reverence to these people who have died protecting your freedoms, which again, most people have a hard time describing what those freedoms actually are. They just know that's what they've been told, and they don't want to question that, especially if they have a friend or family member who was in the military and lost their lives, because that's not only questioning what you were taught to believe, it's also eventually going to lead you questioning the character of that loved one. Because once you start to make these connections, it's really hard to see. Once you make these connections, it's really hard to avoid the fact that even the ones with the best intentions, even the ones that really thought they were protecting freedoms, that they really thought that they were defending their fellow man, even the ones that were honestly duped into this, they still are morally culpable for all the actions they took. Because to blame it just on the politicians, just on the bankers, just on the corporations, whoever you personally want to hold responsible for these wars and what goes on, they wouldn't happen if people didn't agree to fight. Without soldiers, how do you have a war? So yes, many of these people may have had wonderful intentions. Many of these people may have honestly been led astray. I give a lot more lenience to that with the people who were involved in these situations before the advent of the internet, because now the dissemination of information is so much faster that it really is a choice to be ignorant. So I'll cut them a little slack for not being able to get some of this information. But at the end of the day, just because you were given an order and you believe that you need to follow that order because that's what's been beaten into your head, you are still morally culpable for what you do in carrying out that order. Because I was just following orders defense didn't work very well in the Nuremberg trials. And for good reason. Because to say that I am not culpable for what occurred because I was following orders is stripping yourself of all moral agency, and also stating that you cannot think for yourself. And most of those people in every other aspect of their lives had no problem thinking for themselves. So that excuse just doesn't fly. And most people do not want to examine that when it comes to people that they know. They don't want to think that of them. They want to think only of the good intentions. But as always, that is a ends justify the means scenario. And never works out. So when it comes to these federalized holidays where you're supposed to give reverence for people you've never met and supposedly killed in your name or were killed in your name, I find it useful to ask questions of people and continue to push them into really defending their position rather than just repeating the rhetoric they know and accepting that as fact. Like I said, you can just purely go for the Jimmy Russell, because it is fun from time to time, but that doesn't tend to change a lot of minds. If you truly are anti-war and you would really like to see an end to this madness, the best way to do that is to stop creating soldiers. And the best way to do that is to educate as many people as possible. The ones that are still in, the ones that are thinking that are about going in, even the ones that have come out. Talk to them. Ask them questions. Get them to ask themselves questions. There is a growing number of anarchists, voluntarists, believers in a free society in general that I've come across in the past couple of years that are former military. So those people are out there, and it is possible to break that indoctrination. But that's the surest way to end these things, because once the ruling class has nobody that's willing to fight for them, they're going to have a hard time remaining a ruling class. So that's about all I got for today. Thank you guys for watching. It's been Jeremy from the Seeds of Liberty podcast with Abolitionist Abstractions. Peace.